In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a sacred statue vanishes from St. Etheldrada's temple, shattering the peace of a quiet autumn night. Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and sharper mind, steps into a web of secrets woven by a nervous priest, a charming stranger from London, a sullen guard, and a collector whose ambition knows no bounds. As whispers of greed and betrayal ripple through the village, Miss Marple unravels clues, a scratch on a pedestal, a drip of wax, a hidden bundle, leading to a truth as old as the statue itself. In a world where everyone hides something, only one will be unmasked. Chapter 1. The Vanishing. At St. Etheldrada's, the village of St. Mary Mead lay nestled in a fold of the downs, its thatched cottages and winding lanes bathed in the soft gray mist of an autumn morning. The air carried the scent of damp leaves and wood smoke, and the only sounds were the distant bleat of sheep and the rhythmic clink of teacups from the vicarage. Miss Jane Marple, seated by her cottage window, her fingers deftly working a pair of knitting needles, gazed out at the familiar scene. Her eyes, sharp despite her years, missed little. The postman's bicycle wobbling on the cobbles, the butcher's boy whistling off-key, and the peculiar haste of Cherry, her young maid, as she burst through the door, cheeks flushed with news. "Miss Marple, you'll never believe it," Cherry exclaimed, setting down a tray of tea with a clatter. "The sacred statue, the one at St. Etheldrada's, it's gone, stolen in the night, they say." Her voice held the thrill of scandal, a rare treat in their quiet corner of the world. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mild expression unchanged. "Stolen, you say?" she murmured, her tone inviting more. Cherry, ever eager, recounted the morning's gossip. The statue, a relic of blackened oak carved centuries ago, had vanished from its pedestal in the temple's alcove. The village was ablaze with whispers, and Constable Reed was already at the scene, questioning those who might know more. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her mind already turning. St. Etheldrada's temple, a small but ancient structure on the village's edge, was no stranger to her. She had attended its services often, her observant gaze noting the worn pews, the flickering votives, and the statue itself, a figure of serene dignity, its eyes seeming to follow one across the nave. Its theft was not merely a crime, but a violation of the village's heart. "I think," she said, rising with a sprightliness that belied her age, "I shall take a walk to the temple." Clad in her tweed coat and sensible shoes, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, Miss Marple made her way along the lane. The temple stood on a low hill, its gray stone walls softened by ivy, its single spire piercing the mist. A small crowd had gathered, villagers murmuring, their faces a mix of shock and curiosity. Constable Reed, a lanky young man with a notebook clutched like a shield, was attempting to restore order. "Step back, please," he called, his voice cracking with the strain of authority. Miss Marple slipped past the onlookers, her unassuming presence drawing little notice. Inside the temple, the air was cool and heavy, with the scent of old wood and wax. The alcove where the statue had stood was cordoned off with a rope, an ineffectual gesture that amused her. The pedestal, a block of weathered stone, was bare save for a faint scratch along its edge. A mark too deliberate, she thought, for mere accident. Her mind flickered to a long-ago case in Chipping Cleghorn, where a similar mark had revealed a thief's carelessness. 4 figures stood out amid the scene, each a thread in the tapestry of suspicion. Father Anselm, the priest, hovered near the altar, his thin frame taut with distress. His fingers twisted a rosary, the beads clicking in a nervous rhythm, and his eyes darted to the empty alcove as if expecting the statue to reappear. Mr. Giles Hartley, a visitor from London, leaned against a pew, his tailored suit and polished shoes at odds with the temple's simplicity. His smile was polite but distant, as if the village's turmoil were a curiosity to be observed, not felt. Tom Baines, the night guard, stood by the door, his burly frame slouched, his face set in a scowl that dared anyone to approach. And Mrs. Lavinia Crowe, a collector of antiquities, surveyed the scene with an imperious air, her silk scarf a splash of crimson against the muted stone. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on each in turn. Father Anselm's agitation suggested more than spiritual concern, perhaps a secret weighing on his conscience. Mr. Hartley's detachment hinted at a man accustomed to keeping his own counsel, but his cufflinks, dusted with a faint gray powder, caught her eye. Temple dust, perhaps? Tom Baines's sullenness was unsurprising. He was known for his temper, but the scuff on his boots suggested recent haste, not the steady tread of a guard's rounds. And Mrs. Crowe, with her sharp eyes and sharper ambition, seemed to appraise the temple as if it were hers to claim. Miss Marple recalled a neighbor from her youth, a woman whose greed for rare porcelain had led to unsavory deeds. Constable Reed approached, his notebook flapping. "Miss Marple, this is no place for civilians," he said, flushing at her serene smile. "I'm only here to help, Constable," she replied, her voice gentle but firm. "A cup of tea often loosens tongues, you know." He blinked, unsure whether to argue, and she moved away, her mind already sifting through the morning's impressions. The statue's theft was no random act, she was certain. It required planning, nerve, and perhaps a betrayal of trust. As she stepped back into the mist, her knitting bag swinging lightly, Miss Marple felt the familiar thrill of a puzzle unfolding. The village of St. Mary Mead, for all its quiet charm, had secrets, yet to yield. Chapter 2. The Temple's Secrets. The mist had thickened over St. Mary Mead by the time Miss Jane Marple returned to St. Etheldrada's temple the following morning, her sturdy umbrella warding off the drizzle that clung to her tweed coat. The village, still reeling from the theft of the sacred statue, hummed with a nervous energy, like a hive disturbed. Gossip flowed freely in the tea shops and over garden fences, each villager adding their own flourish to the tale. Miss Marple, however, preferred facts to fancies, and the temple, with its ancient stones and silent shadows, held secrets she was determined to unravel. St. Etheldrada's was no grand edifice, but its simplicity belied a history as rich as any cathedral's. Built in the 12th century by monks seeking solitude, it had weathered wars, plagues, and the slow march of time. The sacred statue, a small figure of blackened oak depicting the saint with a serene, almost reproachful gaze, was its heart. Legend held that the statue, carved by a monk whose name was lost to time, brought blessings to those who knelt before it. Farmers swore it ensured bountiful harvests. Mothers claimed it safeguarded their children. Its theft was not merely a loss of wood and craftsmanship, but a wound to the village's soul, a desecration that left even the skeptical uneasy. Miss Marple entered the temple through its heavy oak door, the hinges creaking in protest. The interior was dim, lit only by the weak light filtering through stained glass windows, their colors muted by the overcast sky. The air smelled of damp stone and beeswax, and the silence was broken only by the faint drip of water from a leak in the roof. Constable Reed had departed, leaving the temple in the care of Mrs. Phipps, the caretaker, whose robust figure was bustling about with a broom, her face set in a scowl of righteous indignation. "Good morning, Mrs. Phipps," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but carrying in the quiet space. The caretaker turned, her broom pausing mid-sweep. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's a dreadful thing, isn't it? The statue gone, and not a soul knows how." Her voice, usually booming, quavered with emotion, and her eyes darted to the empty alcove where the statue had stood. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, settling onto a pew and adjusting her spectacles. "Dreadful indeed. I thought I might have a look around if you don't mind. Sometimes a fresh pair of eyes sees what others miss." Mrs. Phipps, mollified by the prospect of an ally, launched into a torrent of details. The statue, she explained, was small, barely a foot tall, but heavy for its size, its oak dense with age. The pedestal, a block of limestone, was bolted to the floor, a precaution taken after a near theft in the last century. "It'd take a strong hand and a cunning mind to shift it," she said, her eyes narrowing. "And tools, mark you. No one just walks off with it under their arm." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the alcove, where the pedestal stood like a mourner at a grave. The scratch she had noticed yesterday was clearer in the morning light, a thin, precise line, as if made by a metal tool slipped under the statue's base. She rose, her knitting bag in hand, and approached the alcove, her steps deliberate. Kneeling with a care that belied her age, she examined the mark closely. It was not the haphazard scrape of a careless hand, but a calculated incision, suggesting patience and purpose. She recalled a case from her youth when a jeweler's chisel had left a similar mark on a stolen brooch's setting. The thief, she remembered, had been a man of meticulous habits, undone by his own precision. Mrs. Phipps, hovering nearby, offered more. "I saw something odd last evening, before it all happened," she confided, lowering her voice as if the walls might listen. "A shadow, moving by the yew trees near the gate, too tall for a fox, too quiet for a drunkard. I told Constable Reed, but he said it was likely nothing." Her tone suggested she thought otherwise, and Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with interest. "A shadow, you say? At what time?" Mrs. Phipps frowned, thinking. "Just after 6, as I was locking up. The Vespers service had ended, and Father Anselm was in his study." Miss Marple filed this away, her mind already weaving connections. A shadow at dusk, a precise scratch, a bolted pedestal. These were not the work of an impulsive thief. She wandered the temple's nave, her eyes tracing the flagstones, worn smooth by centuries of feet. The alcove was tucked in a corner, partially obscured by a pillar, making it a discreet spot for mischief. Yet the temple was never truly empty. Villagers came and went, and the grounds were patrolled by Tom Baines at night. The thief had chosen a narrow window of opportunity, one that required knowledge of the temple's rhythms. She paused by a side door, its lock rusted but intact. A faint smudge of dirt marred the threshold, as if a boot had brushed against it in haste. Bending closer, she noted a speck of green paint, barely visible against the stone. It was an odd detail, one that stirred a memory of her nephew Raymond's studio, where a painter's carelessness had once betrayed a forgery. She made a mental note to inquire about recent visitors to the temple, someone perhaps with paint on their hands. Returning to Mrs. Phipps, Miss Marple adopted her most disarming smile. "Tell me, Mrs. Phipps, who was here yesterday, before the theft?" The caretaker puffed up, eager to share. Father Anselm, of course, had been in and out, tending to his duties. Mr. Giles Hartley, the London visitor, had spent an hour sketching the stained glass, his notebook filled with hurried lines. Tom Baines had checked the grounds at dusk, though Mrs. Phipps sniffed that he'd seemed distracted, likely dreaming of the pub. And Mrs. Lavinia Crowe had visited in the afternoon, her imperious voice echoing as she questioned Father Anselm about the statue's history. "Wanted to know every detail," Mrs. Phipps said, her tone sour, as if she'd buy the place if she could. Miss Marple's needles, retrieved from her bag, began to click softly as she listened. Mrs. Crowe's interest was no surprise. Her collection of relics was the talk of the county, and her ambition was matched only by her wealth. Mr. Hartley's sketching, however, intrigued her. An art historian, he claimed, yet his presence in St. Mary Mead felt oddly timed. And Tom Baines's distraction raised questions. Had he seen the shadow Mrs. Phipps described, or had he been elsewhere when he should have been vigilant? The temple's history offered another thread. Miss Marple, settling into a chair by the vestry, coaxed Mrs. Phipps into recounting its tales. The statue, she learned, had been a source of miracles, or so the villagers believed. A drought broken after a prayer, a child healed after a mother's vigil. Its wood, blackened by time, was said to come from an oak felled by lightning, a sign of divine favor. Yet its value was not merely spiritual. Antiquarians had long coveted it, and Mrs. Phipps recalled a dealer from Oxford who, years ago, had offered a small fortune for it. Father Anselm had refused, his face pale with indignation. "He guards it like his own child," Mrs. Phipps said, then hesitated. "Though he's been odd lately, hasn't he? Jumpy, like a cat on a hot roof." Miss Marple's needles paused. "Jumpy, you say?" Mrs. Phipps nodded, her broom resuming its work. "Ever since Mrs. Crowe started poking about, she offered to pay for new pews, but only if she could study the statue. Father Anselm didn't like that one bit." The caretaker's voice dropped to a whisper. "And between you and me, Miss Marple, I heard them arguing last week, out by the Lich Gate. She was saying something about a legacy worth more than prayers." This was a thread worth pulling, Miss Marple thought. An argument suggested tension, perhaps a motive. She recalled a case in Saint-Honoré where a curate's refusal to sell a relic had masked his own plan to steal it. Father Anselm's devotion seemed genuine, but devotion could be a mask for darker impulses. She rose, thanking Mrs. Phipps with a warmth that left the caretaker beaming, and stepped outside to the temple grounds. The yew trees, gnarled and ancient, cast long shadows in the drizzle. Miss Marple paced the path where Mrs. Phipps had seen the shadow, her eyes scanning the ground. A patch of mud, churned by recent footsteps, caught her attention. The prints were deep, suggesting weight, perhaps someone carrying a heavy object, like a statue wrapped in cloth. She followed the trail to the gate, where a glint of metal winked from the grass. Stooping, she retrieved a small, twisted piece of wire, its end sharpened like a makeshift tool. A lockpick, she thought, or part of one. Constable Reed might dismiss it as rubbish, but Miss Marple knew better. She tucked it into her bag, alongside her knitting, and made a note to ask the village blacksmith about recent repairs. The drizzle had turned to rain, and Miss Marple opened her umbrella, her mind racing. The statue's theft required not only boldness, but access. Access to the temple, its keys, its routines. Father Anselm held the keys, but his agitation suggested he was no mastermind. Tom Baines, as guard, knew the grounds better than most, yet his drinking habits hinted at negligence, not cunning. Mr. Hartley's presence was too convenient, his polish too perfect. A man like that, she mused, might hide a thief's heart behind a scholar's smile. And Mrs. Crowe, with her wealth and obsession, had both means and motive to claim the statue for her collection. As she walked back to her cottage, the rain pattering on her umbrella, Miss Marple thought of her friend Dolly Bantry, who once remarked that the simplest crimes were the hardest to solve, for they hid in plain sight. The temple's secrets were many, but they were not impenetrable. The scratch, the shadow, the wire, the paint, each was a piece of a puzzle, and Miss Marple's mind, sharp as her needles, was already fitting them together. She would need to speak to the suspects, to watch their eyes and listen to their silences. For now, she would return to her fireside, her knitting, and the quiet certainty that St. Mary Mead's secrets would not elude her for long. Chapter 3. The Priest's Burden. The rain had ceased by mid-afternoon, leaving St. Mary Mead draped in a damp hush, the kind that seemed to muffle secrets as much as sound. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag slung over her arm, made her way to the vicarage, a squat stone building nestled beside St. Etheldreda's temple. The vicarage garden, usually a riot of roses, looked forlorn under the gray sky, its petals strewn like confetti after a storm. She had decided to begin. Her inquiries with Father Anselm, whose nervous demeanor at the temple had caught her attention. In her experience, a man's unease often betrayed more than his words, and Father Anselm's twitching fingers had spoken volumes. The vicarage door was answered by Mrs. Tuttle, the housekeeper, a woman whose dour face suggested she found little joy in her duties. "He's in his study," she said, eyeing Miss Marple's tweed coat with faint disapproval. "Not in the best of moods, mind you." Miss Marple smiled, her expression as mild as milk, and followed the housekeeper through a narrow hall smelling of polish and old books. The study was a small room, its walls lined with theological tomes, and a single window overlooking the temple's spire. Father Anselm sat at a desk, his thin frame hunched over a blank sheet of paper, a pen idle in his hand. His rosary lay coiled beside him, its beads glinting in the lamplight. "Good afternoon, Father," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair uninvited, her knitting bag at her feet. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Her voice was gentle, almost apologetic, but her eyes were sharp, noting the absence of sermon notes, the untouched ink pot, the faint tremor in the priest's hands as he looked up. "Not at all, Miss Marple," he replied, though his smile was strained, like a rope fraying at the edges. "It's a trying time, as you can imagine. The statue, it's more than a loss. It's a violation." His voice cracked on the last word, and he clutched the rosary, the beads clicking in a staccato rhythm. Miss Marple nodded, her needles emerging from her bag with a soft clink. "A dreadful thing," she agreed, her fingers beginning their familiar dance. "The statue meant so much to the village, and to you, I imagine, as its guardian." She paused, letting the silence invite confession, a trick she had learned from years of village gossip. Father Anselm's eyes flickered to the window, where the temple loomed like a silent accusation. "My duty is to the parish," he said, his voice low. The statue was a symbol, yes, but also a responsibility. I failed to protect it. His fingers tightened on the rosary, and Miss Marple noted a bead of sweat on his brow, despite the coolness of the room. She thought of her cousin Ethel, whose nervous habits had once betrayed a hidden debt. Guilt, she knew, wore many masks, and Father Anselm's was one of piety stretched thin. "Tell me, Father," she said, her tone as soothing as a lullaby. "What did you do the night of the theft? Routine can be so comforting, can't it?" She smiled, her needles clicking steadily, as if the question were mere pleasantries. Father Anselm hesitated, his gaze dropping to the desk. "I was here," he said at last, "preparing my sermon for Sunday, the parable of the lost sheep. Fitting, perhaps, given the circumstances." He attempted a laugh, but it died in his throat, brittle as autumn leaves. Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the desk, bare save for the paper and pen. No crumpled drafts, no scattered notes, nothing to suggest the labor of a sermon. "You must have worked late," she said, her voice light. "Mrs. Phipps mentioned Vespers ended at 6. Did you see anyone near the temple after that?" Father Anselm's hand jerked, the rosary beads scattering across the desk. He scrambled to gather them, his face flushing. "No, no one," he said too quickly. "I was absorbed in my work." She nodded, her expression unchanged, but her mind catalogued the lie. A man absorbed in work did not leave his desk so pristine, nor did his hands shake at the mention of the temple. She recalled a young curate from her youth, whose fervent sermons hid a penchant for pilfered alms. Father Anselm's devotion seemed genuine, but devotion could be a cloak for desperation. "It must be difficult," she said, her needles pausing, "to bear such a burden alone. The statue's loss weighs heavily. I'm sure." Father Anselm's eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw a flicker of something, fear, perhaps, or shame. "It does," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "The village trusts me, and I—" He trailed off, his gaze returning to the window. Miss Marple did not press, sensing the thread was too fragile to pull just yet. Instead, she shifted the conversation to village matters, asking about the choir, the flower rota, the recent repairs to the temple roof. Father Anselm answered mechanically, his tension easing only slightly. As she rose to leave, her eyes caught a detail she had missed. A small wooden box on a shelf, its lid slightly ajar, revealing a glint of metal inside. A key, perhaps? She made no comment, but her mind filed it away, alongside the priest's unease and the barren desk. "Thank you, Father," she said, her smile warm. "You've been most kind. I do hope the statue is found soon." He nodded, his face pale, and she stepped into the hall, where Mrs. Tuttle waited, her expression sour as ever. Outside, the air was crisp, the sky clearing to reveal a pale sun. Miss Marple paused by the vicarage gate, her thoughts turning to Cherry's gossip from the previous evening. The maid had overheard a snippet at the post office, Father Anselm arguing with Mrs. Lavinia Crow near the temple a week before the theft. The collector's voice had carried sharp and insistent, speaking of a treasure too valuable for a village. Father Anselm had rebuffed her, his tone fierce, but Cherry's source, a grocer's boy with a knack for eavesdropping, claimed the priest had looked like he'd seen a ghost afterward. Miss Marple's needles clicked as she walked, her mind weaving the threads. Mrs. Crow's interest in the statue was no secret, her collection housed in a manner that gleamed with polished relics, was the envy of antiquarians. Had she pressed Father Anselm too hard, tempting him with funds the temple sorely needed? Or had their argument masked a deeper complicity? The priest's nervousness suggested a man caught in a web, but whether he was spider or fly remained unclear. She passed the village green, where children played under the watchful eyes of mothers. One, a rosy-cheeked girl named Polly, waved at her, and Miss Marple smiled, remembering Polly's father, a carpenter who had repaired the temple's pews last spring. He had mentioned Father Anselm's distraction then, his hands fumbling with keys as if his mind were elsewhere. Keys, she thought, her steps slowing. The temple's locks were old but sturdy, requiring a specific key, likely the one in Father Anselm's box. Had he misplaced it, or lent it to another? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sight of Mr. Giles Hartley, the London visitor, strolling toward the Blue Boar Inn. His suit was immaculate, his stride confident, but Miss Marple noted a faint smudge on his sleeve, gray and powdery, like the dust of the temple's stones. She recalled his presence at the temple yesterday, his notebook filled with sketches that seemed more performative than purposeful. A man like Hartley, she mused, was not unlike her nephew Raymond's friend, a critic who hid his ignorance behind a veneer of charm. Was Hartley observing the village or studying it for his own ends? She resolved to speak with him next, but first she needed more of the village's pulse. Stopping at the post office, she chatted with Miss Hartnell, whose sharp tongue and sharper memory missed little. "Father Anselm's not been himself," Miss Hartnell confided, sorting letters with a snap. "Ever since that Crow woman started sniffing about. Offered to pay for a new roof, she did, but only if she could borrow the statue for her collection. Borrow my foot?" Miss Hartnell's snort was eloquent, and Miss Marple nodded, her needles never faltering. The walk back to her cottage was slow, her mind heavy with impressions. Father Anselm's burden was more than spiritual, she was certain. His lie about the sermon, his trembling hands, the key in the box, all pointed to a man wrestling with more than guilt over a stolen statue. Had he been tempted by Mrs. Crow's wealth only to regret it? Or had he seen something that night, something he dared not confess? Miss Marple thought of her old friend Canon Pennyfather, whose absent-mindedness had once concealed a deeper fear. People, she knew, were rarely what they seemed, and Father Anselm's piety was no exception. By her fireside that evening, her knitting in her lap, Miss Marple sifted through the day's findings. The priest's burden was a thread in the tapestry, but it was tangled with others. Mrs. Crow's ambition, Hartley's polish, Tom Baines's sullenness. The statue's theft was no simple act of greed. It was a knot of motives, waiting for her patient fingers to unravel. She smiled, her needles resuming their rhythm. Tomorrow, she would seek out Mr. Hartley, and perhaps the village's whispers would yield another clue. For now, the fire crackled, and St. Mary Mead's secrets waited in the shadows. Chapter 4. The Visitor from London. The morning sun broke through the clouds over St. Mary Mead, casting a golden sheen on the wet cobbles and thatched roofs, as if to coax the village from its gloom. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag tucked under her arm, stepped lightly along the lane toward the Blue Boar Inn, where Mr. Giles Hartley, the enigmatic visitor from London, was staying. The theft of the sacred statue had stirred the village like a stone tossed into a still pond, and Mr. Hartley, with his polished manners and vague purpose, was a ripple Miss Marple could not ignore. She had learned, over years of observing human nature, that strangers in small villages were rarely as innocent as they seemed, and Hartley's presence at the time of the theft was a coincidence she did not trust. The Blue Boar was a quaint establishment, its sign creaking in the breeze, its windows gleaming with fresh polish. Inside, the air smelled of ale and freshly baked bread, and the innkeeper, Mr. Dobbs, greeted Miss Marple with a nod, his eyes wary. "Mr. Hartley's in the parlor," he said, gesturing toward a door at the back. "Bit of a queer one, if you ask me, always scribbling in that notebook of his." Miss Marple thanked him, her smile disarming, and made her way to the parlor, her sensible shoes silent on the polished floor. Mr. Hartley was seated by a window, a cup of coffee before him, his notebook open to a page filled with angular sketches of St. Etheldrada's stained glass. He looked up as she entered, his face breaking into a smile that was all charm and no warmth. "Miss Marple, what a pleasure," he said, rising with a grace that seemed practiced. "To what do I owe this visit?" His voice was smooth, with the faintest trace of a London accent, and his eyes, sharp and blue, assessed her as one might a curiosity in a museum. "I was passing by," Miss Marple said, settling into a chair and drawing out her knitting, "and thought I might trouble you for a chat. The village is all aflutter about the statue, and you, being a scholar of such things, might have insights." Her tone was light, almost deferential, but her needles clicked with a steady rhythm, and her eyes missed nothing. The faint tension in Hartley's jaw, the way his fingers brushed the edge of his notebook, as if to shield it. "A terrible loss," he said, leaning back with an air of studied ease. "The statue is a fine example of medieval craftsmanship. Early 12th century, I'd wager, with influences from the Cluniac order. I was sketching its details only the day before it vanished." He gestured to his notebook, but Miss Marple noted that the sketches were of the windows, not the statue itself. A curious omission, she thought, for a man so keen on antiquities. She nodded, her needles never faltering. "You must have a keen eye for detail, Mr. Hartley. Did you notice anything unusual that day? A stranger, perhaps, or someone lingering near the temple?" Her question was gentle, but her gaze was sharp, catching the momentary flicker in his eyes before he smiled again. "Nothing out of the ordinary," he replied, sipping his coffee. The temple was quiet, save for Mrs. Phipps fussing about and Father Anselm muttering over his keys. "I was there to study the glass, you see. Its iconography is quite remarkable." He launched into a discourse on medieval pigments, his words flowing with the ease of a lecture. But Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere. She recalled a young man from her youth, a so-called poet, who had charmed a widow with talk of verse while pilfering her silver. Hartley's fluency had the same polished edge, as if designed to deflect. Her eyes drifted to his cufflinks, glinting in the sunlight. The gray dust she had noticed at the temple was gone, but a faint smudge remained on his sleeve, barely visible against the dark wool. "You must find our little village dull after London," she said, her voice warm. "What brought you to St. Mary Mead?" The question was casual, but she watched him closely, noting the slight tightening of his fingers on the coffee cup. "A whim," he said, his smile unwavering. "I've been cataloging rural churches for a monograph. St. Etheldrada's caught my eye in an old journal, its statue in particular. A pity I'll never finish my notes on it now." His tone was regretful, but Miss Marple sensed a rehearsed quality, like an actor delivering lines. She thought of her nephew, Raymond's friend, a critic who hid his ignorance behind grand words. Was Hartley's scholarship genuine, or a mask for something else? She shifted the conversation, asking about his travels, his impressions of the village. He spoke easily, describing churches in Kent and Sussex, but his details were vague, lacking the specificity of a true scholar. When she mentioned the scratch on the statue's pedestal, his smile faltered, and he turned the page of his notebook, revealing a blank sheet. "A scratch?" he said, his voice light but strained. "I didn't notice. My focus was on the glass." He gestured to the window, where the sun cast colored patterns on the floor, but Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the notebook. Its pages were crisp, the sketches hurried, as if drawn to impress rather than record. The parlor door opened, admitting Mr. Dobbs with a tray of scones. "Thought you might like these, Miss Marple," he said, his eyes flicking to Hartley with a hint of suspicion. Miss Marple thanked him, her mind turning to the innkeeper's earlier remark about Hartley's scribbling. "Do you keep many notes, Mr. Hartley?" she asked, breaking a scone with delicate fingers. "I find a notebook can reveal so much about a person's interests." He laughed, a touch too loudly. "Just sketches and jottings," he said, closing the notebook with a snap. "Nothing of consequence." But Miss Marple noted the haste of the gesture, the way his hand lingered on the cover, as if guarding a secret. She recalled a case in Saint-Honoré, where a thief's diary had betrayed his plans, its pages filled with codes disguised as doodles. Was Hartley's notebook a scholar's record, or something more? As they ate, she steered the conversation to the temple's visitors, mentioning Mrs. Crow's interest in the statue. Hartley's expression remained neutral, but his eyes sharpened. "A formidable woman," he said. "She was asking Father Anselm about the statue's provenance when I was there. Quite insistent, I thought." His tone was casual, but Miss Marple caught a note of disdain, as if he found Mrs. Crow's ambition distasteful or threatening. She rose, thanking him for his time, her knitting tucked back into her bag. "You've been most helpful, Mr. Hartley," she said, her smile serene. "I do hope you enjoy your stay in St. Mary Mead." He bowed slightly, his charm intact, but as she stepped into the inn's hall, she felt his eyes on her, assessing, calculating. Outside, the sun had warmed the air, and she paused by the inn's garden, where a boy was sweeping leaves. "Young Tommy," she called, recognizing the innkeeper's son. "Did you see Mr. Hartley yesterday before the statue was stolen?" Tommy, eager for a penny, nodded. "He was out by the temple gate, miss, just after dusk. Had his notebook, but he wasn't drawing. Looked like he was waiting for someone." Miss Marple slipped him a coin, her mind racing. Waiting for someone, or watching the temple. She recalled the shadow Mrs. Phipps had seen, the muddied footprints near the yews. Hartley's polished exterior was beginning to crack, revealing glimpses of something less pristine. Her walk back to the village was slow, her thoughts a tangle of threads. Hartley's presence at the temple, his vague scholarship, his notebook's inconsistencies, all pointed to a man playing a part. But what part? A thief, a lookout, or merely a curious bystander? She thought of Tom Baines, the guard, whose absence that night had left the temple vulnerable. Had Hartley known of it, perhaps through village gossip? And Mrs. Crow's argument with Father Anselm, had Hartley overheard it, using it to his advantage? By her cottage gate, she paused, her eyes on the distant temple spire. Hartley was a puzzle, but not an unsolvable one. She would need to learn more about his London connections, perhaps through her friend Sir Henry Clithering, who had contacts in the city. For now, she would watch and listen, letting the village's whispers fill in the gaps. Her needles would wait, but her mind was already knitting the clues into a pattern, one that would soon reveal the truth behind the visitor from London. Chapter 5. The Guard's Silence. The afternoon light in St. Mary Mead was soft, filtered through a veil of clouds that promised more rain. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag a familiar weight at her side, walked the narrow path to Tom Baines's cottage, a squat, ivy-clad dwelling near the edge of the village. The theft of the sacred statue had cast a pall over St. Etheldreda's temple, and Tom, the night guard, was a figure of growing suspicion in the village's murmurs. His sullen demeanor and absence during the critical hours of the theft made him a natural focus for Miss Marple's quiet inquiries. She knew from long experience that silence often spoke louder than words, and Tom's reticence was a language she intended to decipher. The cottage was modest, its garden overgrown with nettles, a stark contrast to the tidy plots of its neighbors. A pair of boots, caked with mud, stood by the door, their soles scuffed in a way that suggested more than a leisurely stroll. Miss Marple knocked, her gloved hand firm, and waited. The door creaked open to reveal Tom Baines, his broad frame filling the doorway, his face a mask of irritation. His eyes, bloodshot and wary, narrowed at the sight of her. "What do you want, Miss Marple?" he growled, his voice rough as gravel. "I've told the constable all I know." Miss Marple's smile was serene, undaunted by his brusqueness. "I'm sure you have, Mr. Baines," she said, her tone as gentle as a summer breeze. "But I was passing by and thought you might indulge an old woman's curiosity. May I come in?" Her request, framed with such disarming politeness, left Tom little room to refuse. He stepped aside with a grunt, and she entered, her eyes taking in the sparse room. A table cluttered with empty bottles, a chair with a sagging cushion, and a fireplace cold with ash. She settled into the chair, her knitting bag at her feet, and drew out her needles, their soft clicking a counterpoint to the tension in the air. "It must be a heavy responsibility, guarding the temple," she began, her voice warm with sympathy. "Especially at night, with only the stars for company." Tom stood by the table, his arms crossed, his expression unchanging. "It's a job," he said curtly. "I do my rounds, check the locks, and that's that." Miss Marple nodded, her needles moving steadily. "And the night the statue was stolen? You were on duty, I presume?" Her question was light, almost casual, but her eyes were sharp, noting the slight twitch in Tom's jaw, the way his fingers tightened on his arms. "Aye," he said, his voice low. "Till midnight. Saw nothing, heard nothing, went home after my rounds." His words were clipped, as if rehearsed, and Miss Marple thought of a village lad from years past, whose curt replies had hidden a poacher's guilt. She tilted her head, her smile unwavering. "Midnight is late for such a quiet village. Did you notice anything unusual? Perhaps a light in the temple, or footsteps on the path?" Tom's eyes flicked to the window, avoiding hers. "Nothing," he said, but his voice held a trace of unease, like a note struck slightly off-key. Miss Marple's needles paused, and she leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Phipps mentioned a shadow near the yews just after 6. You didn't see it then?" Tom's scowl deepened, and he shifted his weight, the floorboards creaking under his bulk. "I told you, I saw nothing. Shadows don't mean a thing." His defensiveness was a thread to tug, and Miss Marple did so gently. "Of course," she said, her tone soothing. "But it's curious, isn't it? A statue so heavy, a pedestal bolted down. It would take time to steal it. Time when a guard might be distracted." The word hung in the air, and Tom's face reddened, his hands clenching. "You calling me a liar, miss?" he snapped, but there was a tremor in his voice, a crack in his bravado. Miss Marple's expression remained serene, her needles resuming their rhythm. "Not at all, Mr. Baines. I only wonder if something, or someone, drew you away that night. The village is full of distractions, after all." She thought of the publican's tale, relayed by Cherry, that Tom had been at the Red Lion well before midnight, his tankard emptied more than once. A drunken guard was no guard at all, and Tom's silence suggested he knew it. He turned away, busying himself with a bottle on the table, though his hands fumbled. "I did my job," he muttered. "If the statue's gone, it's not on me. Ask that priest, always fumbling with his keys, or that fancy Londoner poking about." His mention of Mr. Hartley was sharp, almost accusatory, and Miss Marple filed it away. Had Tom seen Hartley near the temple, or was he deflecting suspicion? Her eyes drifted to the boots by the door, their muddied soles catching the light. "Those look well worn," she remarked, her voice light. "The temple grounds are muddy this time of year, aren't they? Especially near the yews." Tom froze, his back to her, and for a moment the room was silent, save for the click of her needles. "Boots get dirty," he said at last, his tone flat. "Nothing strange about that." But Miss Marple noted the stiffness in his shoulders, the way his hand lingered near the bottle, as if seeking courage. She rose, tucking her knitting away, her smile as warm as ever. "You've been very patient, Mr. Baines," she said. "I do hope the constable finds the statue soon. It would ease so many minds." Tom grunted, his eyes still averted, and she stepped outside, the cool air a relief after the cottage's stuffy tension. As she closed the gate, she glanced back, noting a curtain twitch in the window, as if Tom were watching her departure. The village was stirring now, shopkeepers sweeping their steps, children darting across the green. Miss Marple paused by the post office, where Miss Hartnell was sorting parcels with her usual vigor. "That Tom Baines," Miss Hartnell said, unprompted, her voice sharp with disapproval. "Drunk as a lord the night of the theft, so I heard. Left his post early, and no wonder the statue's gone." Miss Marple listened, her expression attentive, and learned that Tom had been seen stumbling from the Red Lion at 10, his temper frayed after an argument with a stranger. "A man in a fine coat," Miss Hartnell added, her eyes narrowing. "Sounded like that Hartley fellow, come to think of it." This was a new thread, and Miss Marple's mind seized it. Had Hartley and Tom crossed paths that night, perhaps in a confrontation that left the temple unguarded? She recalled the smudge on Hartley's sleeve, the mud near the yews, and now Tom's scuffed boots. The pieces were beginning to align, though the pattern remained elusive. She thanked Miss Hartnell, promising to stop by for tea, and continued her walk, her thoughts turning to the temple's lock and the wire she had found by the gate. A lockpick, she suspected, but whose? Tom's absence suggested opportunity, but his gruffness felt more like shame than cunning. At the village shop, she paused to buy a skein of wool, chatting with the shopkeeper, Mrs. Dane, whose tongue was as quick as her scales. "Tom's been odd lately," Mrs. Dane confided, wrapping the wool. Bought a bottle of whiskey last week, more than he can afford on a guard's wage. Said he needed it for his nerves." Miss Marple nodded, her mind noting the expense, the timing. Was Tom drowning a guilty conscience, or had someone paid him to look the other way? Back at her cottage, she settled by the fire, her knitting in her lap, her thoughts weaving through the day's discoveries. Tom Baines's silence was not the stoic reserve of innocence, but the guarded retreat of a man with something to hide. His drinking, his early departure, his scuffed boots, all pointed to negligence, if not complicity. Yet his mention of Hartley suggested a connection, perhaps a clash that had left the temple vulnerable. Miss Marple thought of a groundskeeper from her youth, whose surliness had masked a bribe taken to leave a gate unlocked. People, she knew, could be swayed by coin or fear, and Tom's bloodshot eyes suggested both. Tomorrow she would seek out Mrs. Lavinia Crowe, whose ambition loomed large in the village's whispers. For now, she let her needles move, their rhythm a counterpoint to the puzzle forming in her mind. The guard's silence was a clue, but it was only one thread in a tapestry that grew more intricate with each passing day. Chapter 6. The Collector's Ambition. The sky over St. Mary Mead was a patchwork of clouds, with shafts of sunlight piercing through to gild the village's rooftops. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag swinging lightly at her side, made her way toward Crowe Manor, the grand residence of Mrs. Lavinia Crowe, the collector whose name was on every villager's lips in connection with the stolen sacred statue. The manor stood at the village's edge, its stone facade imposing, its windows glinting like eyes that saw too much. Mrs. Crowe's reputation as a collector of religious artifacts was matched only by her ambition, and Miss Marple, with her keen sense of human nature, suspected that ambition could be a motive as powerful as greed or fear. The invitation to tea had come unexpectedly, delivered by a dour footman who seemed ill at ease in his starched livery. "Mrs. Crowe wishes to discuss the village charities," the note had read, but Miss Marple knew better than to take such pretexts at face value. In her experience, invitations from the likes of Mrs. Crowe were rarely without purpose, and she intended to use this one to probe the collector's role in the temple's mystery. As she approached the manor's iron gates, she noted the pristine gravel drive, the manicured hedges, and a gardener wielding a crowbar to pry loose a stone. A tool, she thought, not unlike one needed to lift a bolted pedestal. Inside, the manor was a museum of relics. The hall was lined with glass cases displaying chalices, reliquaries, and fragments of ancient manuscripts, each labeled with meticulous care. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on a silver cross, its patina suggesting dubious provenance, and she recalled a case in St. Honoré, where a stolen reliquary had been traced to a collector's pride. Mrs. Crowe greeted her in the drawing room, a space of opulent severity, with dark wood paneling and candles flickering in ornate holders, despite the daylight. The collector was a tall woman, her silver hair swept into a severe chignon, her silk dress rustling as she moved. Her smile was gracious, but her eyes were sharp, appraising Miss Marple as one might a rival bidder at an auction. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to come," Mrs. Crowe said, gesturing to a velvet chair. "I thought we might discuss the village's needs, perhaps a contribution to the temple's restoration." Her voice was smooth, but Miss Marple caught a note of calculation, like a chess player opening with a gambit. She settled into the chair, her knitting bag at her feet, and drew out her needles, their soft clicking a familiar anchor. "A generous thought," Miss Marple replied, her tone warm but measured. "The temple has suffered a great loss, hasn't it?" The statue was its heart. She watched Mrs. Crowe closely, noting the slight tightening of her lips, the way her fingers brushed the edge of a candlestick. "Indeed," Mrs. Crowe said, pouring tea with a steady hand. "A tragedy for the village. Such a piece belongs in a place of reverence, not left to the mercy of thieves." Her words were pious, but Miss Marple sensed a hunger beneath them, as if the statue were a prize she coveted for herself. They sipped tea, the conversation drifting to village matters, charities, the church fete, the need for a new school roof. But Miss Marple's mind was on the room's details. The candles, their wax pooling in precise drips, reminded her of the faint trace she'd found near the temple's pedestal. A crowbar, half hidden in a corner, its handle wrapped in cloth, suggested a tool used with care, perhaps to avoid fingerprints. She recalled Mrs. Phipps's tale of Mrs. Crowe's visit to the temple, her insistence on studying the statue, and the argument with Father Anselm that had followed. "You were at the temple recently, I believe," Miss Marple said, her voice light as she broke a biscuit. "Mrs. Phipps mentioned your interest in the statue's history." Mrs. Crowe's smile did not waver, but her eyes narrowed slightly. "I'm a scholar of sacred art," she said, her tone clipped. "The statue is a remarkable piece, 12th century oak, likely carved by a monastic hand. I offered to fund repairs to the temple in exchange for a closer examination, but Father Anselm was uncooperative." Her voice held a trace of disdain, and Miss Marple thought of a dowager she'd known, whose generosity always came with strings. "A pity," Mrs. Crowe continued, "that such a treasure was so poorly guarded. It's no surprise it was stolen." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her expression serene. "You must feel its loss keenly, as a collector," she said. "It would have been a crown for your collection." The remark was gentle, but it struck a nerve. Mrs. Crowe's hand paused on her teacup, and for a moment her composure slipped, revealing a flash of something, anger perhaps, or longing. "My collection is for preservation, not possession," she said, her voice sharp. "The statue belongs in a setting worthy of its value, not a crumbling temple." The words hung in the air, and Miss Marple noted their weight. Mrs. Crowe's ambition was not merely to own, but to control, to elevate her status through the relics she claimed. She thought of a collector in Chipping Cleghorn, whose obsession with a rare book had led to theft and deceit. "It must be difficult," Miss Marple said, her tone sympathetic, "to see such treasures neglected. Did you ever speak to anyone else about the statue? Mr. Hartley, perhaps, or Tom Baines?" Mrs. Crowe's eyes flickered, but she recovered quickly. "Mr. Hartley was at the temple, scribbling in his notebook," she said. "A dilettante, I suspect, more interested in appearances than scholarship. As for Baines, I barely know the man. A drunkard, from what I hear." Her dismissal was swift, but Miss Marple caught a hint of unease, as if the mention of Tom had touched a nerve. She recalled Miss Hartnell's gossip about Tom's drinking, funded by an unexpected sum, and wondered if Mrs. Crowe's wealth had played a role in his absence that night. The conversation turned to the manor's relics, and Mrs. Crowe rose, leading Miss Marple to a glass case displaying a chalice encrusted with garnets. "From a Burgundian monastery," she said, her voice warm with pride. "Saved from neglect, as all my pieces are." Miss Marple admired the chalice, but her eyes strayed to a small wooden box on a nearby shelf, its lid engraved with a cross. It was similar to the one in Father Anselm's study, and she wondered if it held a key, or perhaps a tool like the wire she'd found by the temple gate. As they returned to their tea, Miss Marple steered the talk to the night of the theft. "The village is full of theories," she said, her needles pausing. "Some say the thief needed time and tools to lift the statue, a crowbar perhaps, or a key to the temple." Mrs. Crow's face remained impassive, but her fingers tightened on her cup. "I wouldn't know," she said. "I was here that evening, cataloging my collection. My staff can confirm it." Her tone was firm, but Miss Marple noted the precision of her alibi, as if prepared in advance. The visit ended with polite farewells, Mrs. Crow's smile as polished as her relics. Miss Marple stepped into the Manor's drive, her mind sifting through the encounter. The collector's ambition was a motive as clear as the candles in her room, and the crowbar, the wax, the box, all were threads in a pattern that pointed to her. Yet her alibi was strong, and Miss Marple knew better than to trust appearances. She recalled a case where a lady's maid had been bribed to lie for her mistress, and wondered if Mrs. Crow's staff were as loyal as they seemed. On her way back to the village, she stopped at the blacksmith's forge, where old Mr. Higgs was mending a gate. "Ever make a key for Mrs. Crow?" she asked, her tone casual. Mr. Higgs scratched his head, his eyes narrowing. "Not a key, but she asked for a tool last month, a thin blade, like for prying. Said it was for a locked chest." Miss Marple thanked him, her mind racing. A prying tool could explain the scratch on the pedestal, and Mrs. Crow's wealth could buy silence, or a guard's absence. By her fireside that evening, her knitting in her lap, Miss Marple pondered the collector's ambition. Mrs. Crow's desire for the statue was palpable, but had she acted alone or with an accomplice? Tom's drinking, Hartley's presence, Father Anselm's nerves, all were threads in the same tapestry, and Mrs. Crow's shadow loomed large among them. Tomorrow, Miss Marple would seek the village's eyes, those quiet observers who saw what others missed. For now, her needles clicked, and the Manor's secrets waited to be unraveled. Chapter 7. A Village of Eyes. The morning in St. Mary Mead was crisp, with a breeze that carried the scent of damp earth and the faint tang of chimney smoke. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag a familiar companion, set out along the village lanes, her steps slow but purposeful. The theft of the sacred statue had woven a web of suspicion around St. Etheldreda's temple, and while her visits to Father Anselm, Mr. Hartley, Tom Baines, and Mrs. Crow had yielded threads of motive and opportunity, the pattern remained incomplete. She knew from long experience that villages like St. Mary Mead were never truly silent. Their eyes, shopkeepers, children, gossips, saw what the guilty hoped to hide. Today, she would listen to those eyes, letting the village's whispers guide her closer to the truth. Her first stop was the village shop, where Mrs. Dane presided over her counter with the authority of a general. The shop was a hub of gossip, its shelves stocked with tinned biscuits and news in equal measure. Mrs. Dane, her apron crisp despite the morning's rush, greeted Miss Marple with a nod. "Heard you've been poking about the statue business," she said, her eyes gleaming with curiosity. "Half the village thinks Tom Baines was drunk. The other half blames that Londoner. What's your take, Miss Marple?" Her tone was teasing, but Miss Marple sensed an eagerness for fresh tidings. "I'm only an old woman with too much time," Miss Marple replied, her smile disarming as she selected a packet of tea. "But I do wonder what people saw that night. Villages notice things, don't they?" Her question was casual, but her eyes were sharp, catching the spark in Mrs. Dane's expression. The shopkeeper leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Well, since you ask, young Billy Higgs, he's the gardener's boy, saw a car by the temple gate just after dusk. No lights, and the number plate was covered with a cloth. Odd, I thought, for a village like ours." Miss Marple's needles, drawn from her bag, began their soft clicking. "A car, you say? Did Billy see who was in it?" Mrs. Dane shook her head, wrapping the tea with a flourish. "Too dark," he said, "but it was a sleek thing, not like the farmers' vans. He told Constable Reed, but you know how that lad is, more keen on his notebook than his wits." Miss Marple nodded, her mind filing the detail. A car with a covered plate suggested intent, perhaps a plan to spirit the statue away unnoticed. She recalled Mrs. Crow's manor, with its private drive and garage, and wondered if its contents warranted a closer look. As she paid, Mrs. Dane added, "And there's more. My sister's girl, Jenny, does laundry for Mrs. Crow. Says she saw a bundle carried out of the manor that night, wrapped in black cloth. The footman took it to the stables, quiet-like." Miss Marple's needles paused, her thoughts racing. A bundle could conceal a statue, and the stables offered a hiding place away from prying eyes. "How interesting," she murmured, her tone light. "Jenny's a sharp girl, isn't she?" Mrs. Dane beamed, proud of her niece, and Miss Marple left the shop, her mind weaving the new threads into the tapestry. Her next stop was the village green, where children played under the watchful gaze of mothers. She settled on a bench, her knitting in her lap, and watched as Polly, the carpenter's daughter, chased a ball nearby. "Polly, dear," Miss Marple called, her voice gentle. The girl, rosy-cheeked and breathless, trotted over. "Did you play near the temple last evening, before the statue was stolen?" Polly nodded, her eyes wide. "I saw Mr. Hartley there, miss, with his notebook. He was talking to a man by the gate, a big man, like Mr. Baines, but they were cross with each other." Miss Marple smiled, slipping Polly a sweet from her bag. "You're a good observer, Polly. Did you hear what they said?" Polly frowned, thinking. "Something about keeping your end." Mr. Hartley looked angry, and Mr. Baines stomped off. Miss Marple thanked her, her mind turning to the publican's tale of Tom's argument with a man in a fine coat. Was Hartley pressing Tom to neglect his duties, or had their clash been a distraction? The phrase, "keeping your end," suggested an agreement, perhaps one gone sour. She recalled a case in Much Benham, where a groundskeeper's quarrel had masked a coordinated theft. Her walk took her past the blacksmith's forge, where old Mr. Higgs was, hammering a horseshoe, his face red from the fire's heat. She paused, exchanging pleasantries, then asked, "Mr. Higgs, you tend the temple grounds sometimes, don't you? Did you notice anything odd near the gate recently?" The blacksmith wiped his brow, his eyes narrowing. "Funny you ask, Miss Marple. Found a bit of metal by the gate 2 days ago, twisted like a broken lockpick. Thought it was junk, but it was too clean for that. Gave it to Constable Reed, but he just shrugged." Miss Marple's heart quickened. The wire she'd found was likely its twin, a tool for a skilled hand. "You've a keen eye," she said, and Mr. Higgs grinned, pleased. As she continued her circuit, she stopped at the post office, where Miss Hartnell was sorting letters with her usual vigor. "That Mrs. Crow," Miss Hartnell said, unprompted. "She's been sending packages to London lately. Big ones, too. Says it's for her collection. But who sends relics in such a hurry?" Miss Marple listened, her needles clicking, and learned that one package had been dispatched the morning after the theft, addressed to an auction house known for discreet sales. "Curious timing," Miss Marple remarked, her tone mild, but her mind noted the possibility of the statue leaving St. Mary Mead under cover of legitimacy. By late afternoon, she returned to her cottage, her mind brimming with the village's observations. The car with the covered plate, the bundle in Mrs. Crow's stables, Hartley's argument with Tom, the broken lockpick. All were pieces of a puzzle, each pointing to a carefully planned theft. She settled by her fire, her knitting untouched, and thought of her friend Dolly Bantry, who once solved a mystery by noticing what was absent. A truthful account. The village's eyes had seen much, but what they hadn't seen, a clear view of the thief, a trace of the statue, spoke just as loudly. The car suggested Mrs. Crow's resources, the bundle her secrecy. Hartley's clash with Tom hinted at collusion or coercion, while the lockpick pointed to a skilled hand, perhaps one hired by wealth. Father Anselm's nerves, too, lingered in her thoughts. Had he seen the car or known of the bundle? She recalled a case where a village's collective gaze had unmasked a smuggler, each small observation building to a revelation. St. Mary Mead's eyes were many, and their whispers were weaving a net around the guilty. Tomorrow she would revisit the temple, seeking the wax drip she'd noticed earlier, a clue that tied to Mrs. Crow's candles. For now, she let her needles resume their rhythm, her mind sifting through the day's harvest. The village's eyes had spoken, and their words were bringing her closer to the truth. Chapter 8. The Thread Unravels. The morning in St. Mary Mead was still, the air heavy with the promise of rain, as if the village held its breath for the resolution of the mystery that gripped it. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag a steadfast companion, set out for St. Etheldrada's temple once more, her mind a tapestry of threads gathered from the village's eyes and her own sharp observations. The theft of the sacred statue had woven a web of suspicion around Father Anselm, Mr. Giles Hartley, Tom Baines, and Mrs. Lavinia Crow, each with motives and opportunities that tangled like brambles. Yet Miss Marple knew, from years of unraveling human follies, that the truth often lay in the smallest details, those overlooked by the hasty or the proud. Today, she hoped to find the final thread to pull the puzzle apart. The temple was quiet, its stone walls cool against the damp air. Mrs. Phipps, the caretaker, was absent, leaving the nave empty save for the faint echo of Miss Marple's footsteps. She approached the alcove where the statue had stood, her eyes drawn to the pedestal's scratch, a precise mark that spoke of deliberation. Kneeling with care, she drew a small torch from her bag, its beam cutting through the dimness. The light revealed what daylight had obscured, a faint drip of wax on the floor, pale and hardened, near the pedestal's base. She touched it gently, noting its texture. Soft, not brittle, suggesting recent use. The temple used electric lights for services, and candles were rare, save for special rites. Miss Marple's mind flickered to Mrs. Crow's manor, where candles burned in every room, a quirk of her historical aesthetic. The wax was a clue, delicate but damning. She rose, her thoughts turning to the village's whispers. Billy Higgs's tale of a car with a covered plate, Jenny's sighting of a bundle in Mrs. Crow's stables, Polly's account of Hartley's argument with Tom, and Mr. Higgs's discovery of a broken lockpick. Each pointed to a plan, meticulous and bold, requiring access, tools, and a moment of unguarded opportunity. Tom's drunken absence had provided the window, Hartley's presence a possible distraction, and Father Anselm's nerves a hint of complicity or fear. But Mrs. Crow's ambition loomed largest, her wealth and obsession a motive as clear as the wax on the floor. Miss Marple stepped outside, her torch tucked away, and paced the temple grounds, her eyes scanning the yew trees where Mrs. Phipps had seen a shadow. The muddied path, still soft from recent rain, bore no new prints, but she recalled the deep impressions she'd found earlier, suggesting a heavy load, perhaps the statue, wrapped to conceal it. She followed the path to the gate, where the lockpick fragment had caught Mr. Higgs's eye. The gate's lock was old but intact, requiring a key or skill to bypass. Father Anselm held the temple keys, but Mrs. Crow's request for a prying tool from the blacksmith suggested another means of entry. Her thoughts were interrupted by Constable Reed, who approached with his notebook, his face flushed with the effort of authority. "Miss Marple, you're here again," he said, his tone a mix of exasperation and respect. "Any theories?" She smiled, her expression mild. "Only observations, Constable. The wax by the pedestal, for instance. Curious, don't you think, in a temple lit by electricity?" Reed blinked, his pencil pausing. "Wax? I hadn't noticed." Miss Marple nodded, her voice gentle. "You might look at Mrs. Crow's stables, too. Jenny mentioned a bundle there, the night of the theft. It could be nothing, of course." She let the suggestion hang, knowing Reed's ambition would spur him to act. As he hurried off, promising to investigate, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, her mind sifting through the clues. The wax, the bundle, the car, the lockpick. All pointed to Mrs. Crow, whose ambition to possess the statue was matched by her resources to steal it. Yet the others played roles. Tom's absence, Hartley's argument, Father Anselm's keys. She recalled a case in Saint-Honoré where a theft had unraveled when a single clue, a smudged fingerprint, tied the guilty together. The wax was her fingerprint, but she needed proof to bind it to the thief. That afternoon she called on her friend Mrs. Bantry, whose sharp wit and love of gossip made her a valuable ally. Over tea in Mrs. Bantry's cozy parlor, Miss Marple shared her findings, omitting no detail. "Mrs. Crow's candles are the key," she said, her needles clicking. "And the bundle in her stables. Jenny saw it carried out that night. If it's the statue, it's still close." Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened, her teacup forgotten. "You think she'd hide it in her own stables?" Bold as brass. Miss Marple nodded, her smile faint. Boldness is her nature, but she'd need help, someone to unlock the temple, someone to distract the guard. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, her voice a whisper. "Hartley, perhaps. He's too smooth by half, and Tom Baines, always at the Red Lion when he should be working." Miss Marple agreed, her thoughts aligning with her friends. Hartley's argument with Tom, overheard by Polly, suggested a deal or a dispute, and Tom's drinking hinted at payment or guilt. Father Anselm's role was less clear. His nerves suggested knowledge, but not necessarily intent. By evening, Constable Reed returned, his face alight with news. "Miss Marple, you were right," he said, bursting into her cottage with uncharacteristic zeal. "We searched Mrs. Crow's stables, found a crate under a tarp, lined with velvet. The statue was inside, plain as day." Miss Marple's needles paused, her heart quickening. "And Mrs. Crow?" she asked, her voice calm. Reed grinned. She's at the station, denying everything, but we found a candle stub in her study, same wax as the temple's, and a locksmith's bill, dated last week, for a key to fit an old lock. Miss Marple nodded, her mind piecing together the final pattern. Mrs. Crow had orchestrated the theft, using her wealth to commission a key. Her visit to the temple to study the lock's design. Tom's drunken absence, likely bought with her coin, had given her the window, and Hartley's argument, perhaps a ploy to keep Tom away, had ensured it. Father Anselm's nerves suggested he'd suspected her plan, perhaps seeing the car or the bundle, but lacked the courage to act. The wax, left in her haste, was her undoing, a careless trace of her presence. At the station, Mrs. Crow's composure cracked under questioning. She admitted to hiring a locksmith, claiming it was for a chest, but the key matched the temple's lock. The statue, she insisted, was meant for her private chapel, a better home than a village temple. No one here valued it, she said, her voice sharp with defiance. It belongs with those who understand its worth. Miss Marple, sipping tea as Reed recounted the confession, thought of a collector she'd known, whose pride had blinded her to consequence. Greed, she mused, was as old as the statue itself. That night, by her fireside, her knitting resumed its rhythm. The village would talk of the theft for weeks, but St. Etheldrada's was whole again, its statue returned to its pedestal. Miss Marple's needles clicked, and she smiled, content that the village's eyes, and her own, had seen the truth through the shadows.